Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the latest educational webinar for GTA partners. Today's webinar is going to be presented by Sven Bierman, who's the director of the Fisheries Transparency Initiative. And Sven's going to present a background to the initiative, plus a summary of the Seychelles' first transparency report. And this is actually the first transparency report that any country has done, so it's quite an achievement. As you know, transparency is a key priority of the GTA, yet we all know that many governments are not actually disclosing even basic information on their fisheries sector, and not all the companies are actually reliably reporting on catch volumes and fishing practices either. And furthermore, the data that is publicly available is often incomplete, outdated, unverified, or not actually even that easily accessible. And of course, this affects the ability to manage fisheries efficiently and sustainably. And Sven's going to explain how the initiative seeks to increase transparency and how doing so can lead to a more sustainable management of the fisheries, particularly the ones we're interested in. The webinar is going to be recorded and will be made available by the GTA website. If I could ask you just to keep your microphones on mute, I know you all have already. And if you have any questions at all, please either use the chat box or there will be time at the end for some questions to Sven. So with that, I shall hand over and say a big thank you and welcome to Sven.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present it today to the Global Tuna Alliance. Let me just share my screen and then bring it up. Should be able to see it.
That's great. Thanks, Sven.
Yeah, perfect. So as Tom said, the occasion is very timely because the government of Seychelles just released their first ever FiTI report on calendar year 2019. We actually just got the heads up from our colleagues in Mauritania that next week a Mauritanian will release their first report. So we're slowly seeing an increase in government transparency when it comes to fisheries management. I would say there's more to do. And if the time allows at the end of this webinar, maybe we can have a bit of a talk about this and get your advice, get your views on this. But what I want to focus on today to a little bit set the scene is three topics. A very brief introduction on the Fisheries Transparency Initiative. I'm aware that there are so many initiatives these days out there, so I think it's good to make sure that everybody understands what the FiTI is about and what the FiTI is not about. We'll spend most of the time then on the Seychelles FiTI report, and in particular, obviously, on the tuna aspects. And then I would like to close it with a current status where we stand and also where we want to go and what is needed and what is currently missing to make this really not, so to speak, a one-hit wonder, but really make this the global norm over the next few years to come. In the interest of time, please allow me to cut my introduction on the need for transparency and the importance for transparency for sustainable fisheries fairly short and simply refer to this quote from the FAO, which still 10 years after its publication hasn't lost its relevance for today. And the reason why I like this quote is it has two aspects. One, it clearly puts an emphasis on the importance of transparency, but it also outlines the various drivers of fisheries. So that kind of statement was a bit of a starting point for the Fisheries Transparency Initiative. And when we got together 2015, it was clear for us that transparency has to address a number of aspects in order to make a meaningful contribution towards sustainable fisheries. So when we started the discussions on how could transparency actually look like, because transparency is is a buzzword these days, and a lot of people talking about it. But when you actually go into a step further and ask, what do you actually mean with transparency? What do you want to see? How do you want to see it? It was not a whole lot. So we started 2015 with two major questions. One, I would say, more on the content side, and that is, what do we actually want governments to make publicly available, so that people understand whether the sector is managed in a sustainable way. And these drivers from that FAO statement were very much in our head when we looked at that particular question. But we also, from the beginning, were clear about, just because governments eventually publish information on a website does not make fisheries more sustainable. This information needs to be used. Governments need to be questioned about the information that they publish. And in order to do so, the information needs to be trustworthy, needs to be credible. And I think we are living in an era where information that is published just by a single stakeholder group, let's say just by government or just by business, does not enjoy that credibility and that trustworthiness. And I spent myself 10 years in the business sector, working on corporate social responsibility reports. And I have to say, the report that I started writing was nothing what then eventually got published. And there's a lot of skepticism on these single stakeholder reports. So we not only looked at the content side, but we also looked at the process side, making sure that this information is used at the end of the day, because people really understand and see it as credible and trustworthy. Now, it took us 2 years to answer these two questions. And the reason why it took so long is because we did it exactly in the spirit of how the entire initiative is set up, and that is in a multi-stakeholder collaboration. So we started with putting together a group of government representatives from Indonesia, from Seychelles, from Mauritania, from Costa Rica, from Sweden. We looked at the business sector, industrial fishing, as well as small-scale fishing associations, Thai Union, the Russian ship owners in West Africa, the fishers folk in Indonesia, Kaopa from West Africa. We obviously included the usual suspects, I would say, from civil society, WWF, Greenpeace, Oceana, and a few more national and regional NGOs, as well as observers. And these observers were most notably the FAO, World Bank, European Union, the OECD, and the African Development Bank. And that group met over the course of 2 years in 5 meetings and really answered these two questions. What is it that we want to see in the public domain? And how do we make sure that information is seen as credible? So the question of what's supposed to be seen is answered by what we call 12 transparency requirements. So this is the answer to the questions, what do we need to know in order to assess whether governments are managing their fisheries in a sustainable way. And it starts with very simple things like laws, regulations need to be published, to what's the state of the fisheries resources, all the way down to things like vessel registry on commercial large-scale fishing, information about the small-scale sector, fisheries subsidies, official development assistance, to, at that time in 2015, 2017, a bit of a newer topic, beneficial ownership in fisheries. So this is really, like, let's say, the content framework of what the Fisheries Transparency Initiative is all about. Now, there are a number of core principles behind the FiTI, and that is absolutely crucial. And if there's one thing I would like you to take away from the webinar, then it is these principles, because I think this is what makes the FiTI somewhat unique, and also explains the progress we have made so far, and why certain instances actually took quite a bit. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, transparency needs trust. So the FiTI is not implemented in countries by us, by the Fisheries Transparency Initiative. In fact, we are something like the guardian of these of the FiTI standard. How the FiTI is implemented in the country is through national multi-stakeholder groups. Let's take the example of the Seychelles. The Seychelles has a national multi-stakeholder group for FiTI, which consists of 12 representatives, 4 government representatives from different ministries, 4 representatives from the business side, retainers, the longliners, small-scale fishing, etc., and national civil society. The same is the case in Mauritania. And this group is really in charge of how the initiative is implemented. This group owns the FiTI report that I will present in just a minute. So this is not a foreign initiative going into a country, putting data together and then saying, this is it. We are just there to help these national multi-stakeholder groups put the reports together in the way that it is compliant with the FiTI standard. The second key aspect is when you look at these 12 transparency requirements, you may say, well, this is a bit, it's a bit challenging. There's a lot of information, etc. Well, a country does not need to have perfect information on all of these 12 transparency requirements, but they need to be transparent about where gaps exist. So a country needs to report against all of those 12 transparency requirements, but they do not need to have all the information. For example, one of the countries where we're active in is Senegal, and the Senegalese small-scale fishing sector is extremely huge. And the country simply does not have the financial resources to do an annual survey of the small-scale fishing sector. So countries are not being punished just because they don't have the financial, human, technical resources to get all that information together, but they need to be transparent about it, where that information exists. And in fact, that could be into a competitive advantage, as we've seen in the case of the Seychelles, where now that the country showed what information is missing, we have donors coming into the country now supporting the government to close these particular gaps. The FiTI is not meant to duplicate or copy existing efforts. If you have seen, or if you will look at the FiTI report for the Seychelles, it's a fairly long report. It has 100 plus pages. This is not how we envision the FiTI reports to be. In the future, we want them to be much smaller because the amount of information that is now in the FiTI report is supposed to be published online on government websites. So we hope to see over time that these FiTI reports really shrink because the information is already published on government websites. There's no scoring. We in FiTI, we don't believe in doing a mathematical country score and then engaging in country discussions on how to raise from 7.3 to 7.4, these kind of things. This is really a tool to help the stakeholders to understand the fisheries sector better, and not meant to be a naming and shaming exercise, even though the report, as you will see, clearly shows where areas are lacking, but this is not done in somewhat of a mathematical, I would say a bit of a superficial exercise. And obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the key aspect for the FiTI is that the information actually gets fed into public debates. And we see this now in both of our countries, where information that is now available already starts discussions on the national level. And we hope that this will spill over also to discussions with business partners, with development partners, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the key principles that make the FiTI, I would say, fairly unique. So in a nutshell, the FiTI is the only initiative that provides a framework for transparency of fisheries management data. And I think that's important. There are other initiatives that focus on some of the drivers that I showed you at the beginning, for example, illegal fishing. Colleagues like Global Fishing Watch focus significantly on transparency in fisheries, but their focus is really on the activities of vessels, whereas we are more on a horizontal base and making transparent the underlying information, what really governs, characterizes the sector, the fishery sector in these countries. We focus on marine fisheries, no inland fisheries, no aquaculture. FiTI is a voluntary initiative, so there's countries voluntarily join the FiTI. We're a global initiative, and we focus on countries' jurisdictional waters. So why we have collaborations with RFMOs, our primary, let's say, target group is coastal countries around the globe. So let me focus a little bit on FiTI and the Seychelles. First statement that I want to make is Seychelles is a tuna economy, but it's an underappreciated tuna economy. And I think one of the reasons that is, and that's not my statement, this is actually from people working here in the Seychelles, is there's a lot of focus on the direct financial contribution from licenses, from the international agreements, for example, with the European Union, etc. But if you look at the overall financial contribution, these contributions from licenses, etc., are actually only 10% of the total economic benefits from tuna. There's much more that need to be understood in order to appreciate the sector better. And that is from an employment point of view. For example, the FiTI report shows that the tuna canning factory here in the Seychelles is the largest single employer in the island. It's also the largest single women employer. We've had a chance, so to speak, to see how important the fishery sector contribution to food and nutrition security is during last year's hard lockdown that the Seychelles had to go into as a country that is almost, I think it's 90% dependent on imported goods. When the port and the airport is closed, a lot of sight turned to the fishery sector to, so to speak, feed the nation. So one of the motivating factors for the Seychelles stakeholders, and particularly for the Seychelles government, is to raise the appreciation of the various aspects that the fishery sector, and in particular tuna, contributes to the well-being of the country. Seychelles have been, from the beginning, very closely aligned with the Fisheries Transparency Initiative. In fact, Seychelles was one of the core members of the advisory group, these 5 meetings that I showed to you earlier. Seychelles reached candidate status in April last year, and then a year later already published its first FiTI report in last April. The FiTI report is an annual exercise because that information needs to be up to date and on time. So there will be a second report being published by the end of this year, and this one will focus then on calendar year 2020. The first report focused on calendar year 2019. So what is that FiTI report all about? It basically has 3 major objectives. Number 1, obviously, there is an assessment against the 12 transparency requirements. And if you want to think about it in very simple terms, it looks at 3 questions. Number 1, each of those transparency requirements, is data available to the government at all, independent of where it is, whether it's in an Excel sheet, sitting on a shelf, or in a web-based database. If information is available to the government, then the next question is it also published online on the government website and freely accessible? So you don't have to ask for it, you don't have to register for it, you don't have to pay for it, but you just go online on a website and access that particular data. And is that information that is published, is that seen as complete by the national multi-stakeholder group? And that is where that power of collaboration really kicks in, because we've seen it during the collaboration, during the putting together the report process. A a lot of different stakeholders from business, government, and civil society have information that really contributes to answering these three questions. The second one is then to actually look at the underlying information and summarize in a way that makes it understandable to a layperson and not to, let's say, a marine biologist with a PhD degree, because we want these reports to contribute to a wide public understanding. And that's why there's a lot of focus on summarizing information and making sure it's really easily understandable for, let's say, media representative, for parliamentarians, business partners, investors, et cetera, et cetera. And if significant gaps are seen, then this national multi-stakeholder group, which again, as I said, in the context of Seychelles is 12 people, they make recommendations to the public authority on how the level of transparency can be further enhanced and strengthened over time. And I'll show you in just a minute what the recommendations from the Seychelles National Multi-Stakeholder Group were. So overall, based on the report that came out on the 16th of April, and I think, Tom, if you send some information afterwards, we can certainly send a link to this report for everybody to look at. It's somewhat easily available on the Seychelles Fishing Authority site. But if you want to summarize it in two simple categories, very positively is that the Seychelles authorities, and in particular the Seychelles Fishing Authority, they have a huge number of information in their databases. But none or most of that information was not published online. And it really is now triggering almost like a cultural change from a more reactive process where information is only given if somebody comes and asks for it, to a more proactive approach to really say, look, we have all the data, let's make it publicly available. And in particular, we were extremely positively surprised to see how the level of detail that the Seychelles have on catch data in particular. Also, as part of that first report, a lot of information that so far has not been publicly available is now shown online or as part of the FiTI report. The status of fish stocks here in the Seychelles, license holder for the sea cucumber fishery. That's a very, very lucrative fishery here in the Seychelles. Lots of rumors, lots of secrets so far. Who are these owners, etc. The FiTI report actually has a list of the names of these license holders now, and a number of fishing agreements are now publicly available to see who gains access to the Seychelles jurisdictional waters. On the negative side, there are still a number of information not available. I think most notably is there are two fishing access agreements with private companies, Taiwanese company in particular, that so far have not been made publicly available due to confidentiality clauses in the contract. And the Seychelles government now has the obligation to make these agreements publicly available over the next 2 years. And every new fishing access agreements that the country engages in cannot have any confidentiality clauses anymore. That is a key commitment that the country become part of the FiTI. There's also no large-scale fishing vessel registry. We had access to the registry. We've seen the amount of vessels, and I can show you a bit of that information in just a bit. But the registry in itself is not publicly available that you can see on a vessel by vessel basis. This is something that the government needs to fix very soon, because this is a non-compliant aspect against the FiTI standard. And so far, despite efforts on a number of fronts, we were unable to determine, or the National Multi-Stakeholder Group was unable to determine, whether there are fishery subsidies given to the large-scale fishing sector, whereas on the small scale fishing sector, this number on fishery subsidies is now made publicly available as part of this FiTI report. So I want to show you a few bits and pieces on the information to make a bit more appetite. So I want to dive in a few examples how does actually look like. So when you look at the level of compliance with the FiTI standard and you look at the transparency assessment, this is how it basically looks like. You know, for example, this is the transparency requirement, large-scale fishing, annual retained catch data. So you see, positively, data is available on a number of aspects, from catches, landings, transshipments, fishing efforts, etc. The information that is stemming from the per seiner fisheries is seen as complete. What really is a major obstacle to say the catch data is complete is the lack of information from the industrial longline fisheries. And that has both things. One is partially unreturned logbooks, where the information is simply not available. And the other part is also administrative aspects within the Seychelles Fishing Authority, where the authorities are unable to gather the information on time. So the information is available, but it's not consolidated yet for the entire year. And this is a major aspect that joining the FiTI and working on the FiTI is now trying to be solved, because with that level of transparency also becomes a higher political focus on that information. Let me just give you an example. The latest annual report on the status of fisheries in the Seychelles is 2014. Now, that is a long time ago, but nobody really challenged that. Nobody really asked for that because it was not made visible, not made transparent. Having these reports now really puts a political pressure on the national authorities in charge of this information to make the data publicly available. And for example, the launch forum of this first report was attended by the president of the Seychelles, who is really interested in making sure that the Seychelles adhere to the FiTI standard completely. So when you look at the summary of the information, we spent, together with the national multi-stakeholder, quite a bit of time on making sure that the sector is understood by non-experts, so to speak. So particularly if you see this graphic up here, it took us quite some time to really visualize how licenses are granted in the Seychelles. Local fishing licenses, foreign fishing licenses, licenses for the fishing vessels, licenses for fishing activities, etc. And it really brought a lot of positive engagement and thinking on a way, because it showed, for example, that one of the more local fish species, the red snapper, is not covered by any licenses. All you need to have is a license for the vessel to go fishing, but the species itself is not under any licenses. So being as a very lucrative fish species, this is obviously something that is now triggering certain questions on that particular aspect. Also, stock assessments that are under the responsibility from the Seychelles fishing authorities. For the first time, it was made transparent how many access agreements the Seychelles actually have, and the answer is 5. The European Union was very well known. Mauritius made it sometimes into the news, but it was unclear, even to colleagues from international organizations, that there was also an agreement with Taiwanese and a company called Top Fortune International. And quite interestingly, the last one, the Korean agreement with Dongwon Industry, there seems to be no actual written agreement. We could not find that agreement, and neither could the Seychelles Fishing Authority. So if we're jumping a bit into more the commercial fishing aspect, and again, this is really just to hopefully make a bit of an appetite for you to download the report and have a look into this. Despite the fact that the Seychelles do not have a public registry online yet, the National Multi-Stakeholder Group was able to put together the overall number. So there are 248 vessels, large-scale vessels, authorized to fish in Seychelles waters. And you can see the breakdown according to vessel type, and you can see the breakdown according to the flag state, which is quite interesting. There's a lot of information on catches. How much have the Seychelles flagged vessel, the 76 that you can see here, how much have they caught over the calendar year 2019 within the EEZ, in foreign EEZs, and on the high seas. However, if you look at the metric ton number here, this has to be seen incomplete because a lot of the information from the industrial longline fishery is missing. So the numbers from the per seiner fleet is seen as complete, but as you can see, and especially if you go back to the amount of vessels here, that obviously is not accurate for an entire calendar year. There's a lot of information about catches from foreign flag, landings, transshipments in Seychelles port. There's also something on foreign ports, fishing efforts, information on imports and exports. And again, what I said earlier, Seychelles is a tuna country. You can see, 86.5% of the exports that the Seychelles generated in 2019 is canned tuna, same as the import. Very, very high number on tuna products. So this really provides a full picture on a number of absolutely crucial aspects on the sector. Now, the National Multi-Stakeholder Group looked at the information, and despite very positive aspects on what information is available, also made clear there's a lot of information still not made publicly available. I think the majority of the information is collated by the government, but it is not shown online. So there was a clear desire to change this. So the National Multi-Stakeholder Group basically put together a very clear recommendation list of high priority, medium, low priorities, when these recommendations need to be completed by the government. And just to show you how these things look like, this is taken from the FiTI report, saying, for example, the Ministry of Fisheries and the Blue Economy has to publish online all foreign fishing access agreements and their associated protocols by the end of this year. They have to make an online registry of the commercial fishing vessels publicly available by September 2021. So this one is part of the seven requirements. And a key aspect, and that's also why these FiTI reports come out on an annual basis, is the monitoring of these commitments, because especially if you follow these large-scale UN meetings, there's a lot of commitments done, and then sometimes get the feeling there's very few follow-ups afterwards. And having that exercise on an annual basis is trying to mitigate that risk that these kind of recommendations are made and then nobody actually implements them afterwards. So we've received a number of very positive responses. And if I say we, I say the Seychelles as well as the Fisheries Transparency Initiative, from Peter Thompson, the UN ambassador for the oceans, Minister for International Cooperation from Sweden, from WWF, the Commonwealth Secretariat, investment banks, investment boards, etc. This really set a positive tone among the stakeholders in the Seychelles to carry on with this exercise, because we also shouldn't forget it's not that easy for stakeholders to acknowledge that certain information is lacking at all, or that certain information cannot be published on time because of internal administrative aspects. So, this commitment that the Seychelles have shown here is, from our point of view, very remarkable, and it really is echoed by the positive responses that we've seen globally. So where do we stand? As you can see, we have a number of countries in our pipeline, somewhat grouped in 3 current focus regions. One is Latin America, one is West Africa, and the third one is the Western Indian Ocean region. So our objective for the next 12 to 24 months is to move these countries, at least one column to my left, and make Mauritania and Seychelles, now that they are publishing their first reports, a compliant country, getting Cape Verde and Senegal to publish these first FiTI reports, and then getting these countries on track of joining the FiTI. And the way we're doing this is strengthened by 2 new programs. One of them is what we call a taking stock program, and that is actually reviewing the level of online available information against the FiTI standard. Because for a country to join and become part of FiTI, the national government needs to make a public commitment, because they need to open their books and they need to be very transparent about this. Now, there are a number of very large fishing countries, coastal countries, that might not join the FiTI anytime soon, such as China, such as Russia. So this new program is actually designed at assessing the level of public available information on their fisheries sector, independent of whether they are a country joining FiTI or not, because this is basically an online inventory taking that we are going to do. And then through this, we hope to start increasing the interest in fisheries transparency. And the second one is, and that is something that I was very happy when Tom reached out to us and said, why don't you present the FiTI to the Global Tuna Alliance? And that is, I would say, the classic theory of change for all these transparency endeavors has always been more data leads to better oversight, leads to better decision-making, leads to better accountability. And that is a very strong theory of change. But I think in particular in the times where we are now, it might not be sufficient enough to get all the governments excited about transparency in fisheries. We need to look much more on an incentive-based, market incentive-based level. So we are starting a program called Benefiting to look at how can market and non-market actors incentivize governments to increase their fisheries transparency. And that is actually my closing question to all of you. How can we stimulate market pressure so that we get similar FiTI reports like we've seen from the Seychelles for other tuna countries? And I'm very happy to hear your views, thoughts on this. So with that, Tom, I would give it back to you.
Great, thanks very much, Sven. That's really, really interesting. There's so much information there.
Yeah, sorry, it was a bit of a rush, but
No, it was great. And it's super that we've managed to record it as well. I know that there'll be people who were unable to make it today that would be very interested. So I'm going to open it up to our attendees, ask if they have any questions at all. Feel free to just shout them out, put your hand up, put them in the chat box. But while people are thinking about that, a question I've got, Sven, is how are you working with other initiatives out there to incorporate the data into their assessments? So we've had presentations on IUU risk tools. There's also sort of slavery risk tools, and there's environmental sustainability tools as well, such as seafood rating lists. Have you got any plans for getting the information that's generated to sort of supplement them or inform them?
Yes, we do, but we haven't done this to be honest, to a large degree. I think if we are, if we're looking at a timeline, you can see from 2015 to 2017, it took us 2 years to put the FiTI standard together. And then it took another 2 years to really establish the initiative as a self-existing initiative. So we're basically working with countries now for 2 years. And over the last 2 years, it was somewhat difficult to have these conversations because you didn't have an example of how it would look like. Having now the Seychelles report, having something in hand and saying, look, this is how it actually looks like. This is the information that countries are going to publish now voluntarily, and they will do this on an annual basis. Makes it much, much easier. So we are already in discussions with the FAO, because the FAO is an observer to the FiTI, and discussing, how can the information that we have now in the FiTI reports be used in their statistics to make sure that on both ends the best available information is there. But we have not done this, to be honest, on a systematic level with other initiatives. This is something that is on our to-do list, and if you have any recommendations on that, very happy to hear about that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sven. I think I might drop you a line with a couple of ideas.
Yeah, please.
Do we have any questions from attendees? I'd be particularly interested to hear from people whether or how you would utilize information like this in your sourcing.
I think Ali has the microphone.
Ali.
Yeah, sorry, I joined a few minutes late, so you might have said this at the end. Really interesting presentation, thanks. Does it include, it's not an assessment, is it? It's or does it require publication of measures relating to effective monitoring and enforcement measures? And if not, should it?
Let me just go back here. So we have a number of aspects that countries report against about fisheries law enforcement. They might be a bit too high level if you really want to get an in-depth understanding of what, let's say, what the Seychelles is doing on monitoring, control, and surveillance. But it does ask questions about who's the lead agency. Is there a national comprehensive plan, for example, to counter IUU fishing? What were the instances of law violations? For example, the 2019 report for the Seychelles shows there were 7 instances of illegal fishing in Seychelles waters. So yes, it is in the report, but potentially just as a door opener into more discussions about this. And this is an interesting aspect. Also, we can see now the Seychelles are getting more and more inquiries about this report, because the report obviously is publicly available. People read it, having these kind of questions. So the Seychelles Fishing Authority, SFA, has just nominated a FiTI focal point, who is exactly the person to ask. Now, if you see information that doesn't make sense, or if you want to know more information about a particular transparency requirement, that person is now there in charge to answer these kind of questions from national as well as international stakeholders. So if there are questions on some of those, very happy to put you in touch with the colleague at the Seychelles Fishing Authority.
Okay.
Did that answer your question, Ali?
It does. I mean, obviously, a lot of dialogue right now around digital traceability, global dialogue and seafood traceability, which is a major step forward. But the dialogue around verification measures for data input, so how do we actually know what's been put into the traceability platform is real data, per se. So it's really about the verification measures being in place and assurance around verification measures that the government should provide are absolutely critical to that dialogue going forward and to the success of digital traceability systems. So it's good to see it there, but yeah, there could be a build on that. But really good to see a contact being put into this whereby market and stakeholders can engage directly.
Yeah, and to be quite honest, I think one of the reasons why information in the Seychelles has not made it online and in the public, like I said, was not because the data was not there. There was a clear lack of demand. We've seen, I said it earlier, the last report is 6 years ago now. So that only happens if nobody's asking. So priorities are set somewhere else, and that starts with the highest, political will on governing the sector. So I think it is important that the Seychelles are now getting, feedback, inquiries that they see. Yeah, there are companies, organizations out there that really use that information. They're interested in that information. So I really encourage all of you and the ones who are watching this at some later point in time to reach out to the Seychelles authorities and ask questions, because that really is, if there is a risk, if nobody's asking for that information, then eventually some stakeholders may say, well, why are we doing this for in the first place? There's no one there to value that information.
Thanks very much, Sven. Any other questions, Till? No, I mean, it was a very comprehensive, Sven, which is fantastic. I'm looking forward to circulating this. Would it be possible to get a copy of your slides as well to share?
Yeah, absolutely.
That would be fantastic. I know people might want to listen, but then refer. That's great. Well, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you very much indeed for joining us today. I've got a list of the attendees that I will send to you, Sven, just for your record. If anyone does have any questions, please email me them, particularly if you're viewing them at a later date, and I'll drop Sven an email with them. I'm sure Sven wouldn't mind that at all. The next webinar is actually going to be tomorrow, which is on the new ocean governance scorecard being developed by Hugh Thomas. So I'll hopefully see many of you there as well. So finally, thank you very much, Sven. Really appreciate that. And we look forward to seeing this develop. I think it's really exciting.
Thank you very much. And like I said, the communication line is open. So if there are any ideas on how we can use the power and the strength of the Global Tuna Alliance and work jointly on this, I would be happy about that.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Sven. And thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.